By the time you reach your senior years, you have a wealth of experience and accumulated wisdom that's worth sharing with others. If you've lived through dramatic times, your memories may be especially prized by the next generation and beyond. Yet many seniors never get around to writing their memories down. At Spelman College in Atlanta, a project is underway to gather the stories of African American women who endured segregation in the southern states. The women tell their stories orally, and young scholars at Spelman write them down and add them to the collection. Let's see how the project is preserving history and creating bonds between seniors and young historians.
They are voices from another era and witnesses to incredible social change. African American women who grew up in the segregated South under the confines of Jim Crow.
It was my grandfather's plantation that I was born and reared on. I don't know how it was that he owned the plantation, because I didn't think it would ever be necessary.
Of course, since I was born in the South, I know nothing about any place other than the South. Not thoroughly. I've been many places, but I was born in the Deep South and have always lived in the Deep South.
The family was made up of 3 boys and 1 sister, and I was very glad to be there, and they were very glad to have me, I think.
Their stories and collective memories chronicle 11 decades of history that has now been passed on to a younger generation. These eye-opening narratives are compiled in Their Memories, Our Treasure, Conversations with African American Women of Wisdom. It's an ongoing oral history project conducted by the Independent Scholars Program at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Gloria Gales is the project's founding director. Dr. Vivian Floyd is providing students with insights on cross-cultural experience. And Dr. Joan Roan is giving them an understanding of gerontological issues.
Time is a continuum. When we hear the stories of the women, we realize so much of what we are experiencing today or trying to understand had its roots in the past. And we remove those artificial lines of time, past, present, and future. And that gives us a sense of movement through our lives, a movement that has meaning, that is rooted in our culture.
Spelman's Oral History Project connected 18 scholars with 23 women between 60 and more than 100 years of age. The participants came from diverse backgrounds in different regions of the South, but they shared the desire to continue the long-standing tradition of oral history in African American culture.
We are blessed by the stories of 23 extraordinary and remarkable African American women of wisdom.
We as African American people are an oral people. There is an old African proverb that says, when an elder dies, we lose a library. We're not only losing libraries, but our young people were not hearing these stories because it's important to hear these stories so they can incorporate that wisdom into their very being.
There is a difference between reading a story, seeing a story, and hearing a story. Because you can read a speech, you can write a speech, but it's not until you hear it and the voice and all the story that goes beyond the voice.
I thought it was very important for younger people of my generation to connect with people of the elders' generation, and I thought that was really profound.
It is a valuable experience for the people who go through this process because it allows them an opportunity to review their lives. So it's important on both ends. And for students to learn about aging and in terms of the kinds of life issues that one faces through the process of aging and the kinds of issues that they have to address in the latter stages of their lives.
For the scholars, this intergenerational project provided a new appreciation for the knowledge, life lessons, and experiences that their elders can pass down. These experiences were shared publicly at a recent book signing and reading ceremony for Their Memories, Our Treasure in Atlanta.
From the narrative of Mrs. Anna English. Tuition was only $300 a year, but Daddy couldn't afford to pay for my sister Thelma and me. Since she was closer to graduation than I was, I told Daddy, I'll get a job. And I did. I worked in a white lady's kitchen.
Among the many eye-opening things that I learned going through these women's histories, the most profound thing to me was learning about the scope of life.
From the narrative of Mrs. Julia Bond. My grandfather was the son born to my great-grandfather and a slave woman. My grandmother was black. She was a slave. My grandfather was biracial.
These women have tales, such a wealth of things that we can gather from these women and then use in so many different ways.
So yes, my grandfather's father was white, but that was true of most people in that generation. Mrs. Julia Bond.
Oral history should give a picture of conditions, families, schools, cities, attitudes, kind of give you a panorama of what life meant as an individual. And when you are living, you don't think about your living, and history comes after.
I had 3 girls and 1 boy, but all those were drilled. Hold your head up high and look for the best. Be the best you can be. So I think we tried to see that they got the best education and everything as they were growing up.
Imagine a symphony, or imagine a tapestry of women from all parts of the country, from ages over 75 to 103, all different backgrounds, different religions, but all who have lived the life and therefore have, through that living, have gained this knowledge that they're able to share with us.
For the women who have been profiled, Spelman College's project is a unique opportunity to pass on a legacy of wisdom that can only come from a lifetime of experiences.
When we talk about oral history, we tend to think of the students as beneficiaries, but really the women themselves are beneficiaries because their lives change as a result of the experience they have with students, the bonding they have with students. One woman, when approached about being a woman of wisdom, said, "I didn't know anyone knew I was still alive." And she began to arrange her days around the students' visits.
I know last year it wasn't so much about gaining a mentor, someone who could teach you all these lessons, but it was gaining a friend, someone who you could relate to and see past an age barrier, see past the gray hair.
I think that our world would be a much better place if more youngsters spoke to women of wisdom and kind of got more of an understanding about what it was like when they grew up and how we can apply a lot of the lessons that they learned in our lives.
In publishing the stories of these women, Spelman College's program is not only connecting the present generation to the past, it's also preserving priceless insights and perspectives that would otherwise be lost forever.
You know, one tends to think of assets in terms of dollars in the bank, but in reality, we say that assets are anything positive that can be transferred from one generation to another.
One of the things we notice about all of the women is that they're humble, exceedingly humble. And when we go to them to ask them to let us sit at their feet, they always say to one, "I have nothing to offer. I'm not an important woman. I have not done anything that is worthy of your attention, that is worthy of this honor." But in the process of telling their story, as they journey to different sites of memory, what they discover is that what they tell us and what they did is, in fact, important to us.
We'll be back in a moment to discuss the Spelman Oral History Project with noted historian Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn. Please stay with us.
In what year was the Civil Rights Act passed in Congress? A. 1865, B. 1875, C. 1925, or D. 1945? Do you know the answer? B. 1875. The first Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875, and a year later, the Jim Crow laws were enacted in the southern and border states of the United States. The Jim Crow laws were eventually annulled by the Second Civil Rights Act, passed in 1964.
I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn to the Daily Apple. Dr. Terborg Penn is known internationally as a historian, an educator, and an author. She holds a PhD in Afro-American history from Howard University, and she has retired from the positions of Professor of History and Coordinator of Graduate Programs at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. She has directed numerous history programs and written many books, the latest of which is African American Women and the Struggle for the Vote. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Your very good friend, Dr. Gloria Gales, who's the founding project director of Spelman College's Oral History Project, said, "In education, we have opened up the lens of race, the lens of class, and the lens of gender. It is now time for us to open up the lens of age." And I think it's such a phenomenal quote. Do you agree with this?
Oh, yes, I do.
Tell me a little bit about why.
Well, one of the problems, I think, is something that Margaret Mead talked about in the later years of her life, the anthropologist Margaret Mead,
Sure.
in a book called Culture and Commitment, where she said, traditionally, the older generation has taught the younger generation, and then the younger generation goes on, and the older generation sort of steps aside. She said that it was time for the younger generation to start teaching the older generation as technology became more advanced and involved, and not to leave people just where they are.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. And I think that age is a very significant factor here. And we still have that ability to have the older generation mentoring the younger generation, but the younger generation still has to mentor the older generation as well.
In what regard?
In a variety of things. If you don't know how to email, you don't have a hint about what to do, who do you go to? You go to your grandchildren or your children, and they need to be encouraged to understand that they need to help their elders, that their elders cannot just be helping them.
So technology has made it a bit of a give and take between the mentor and the mentee.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that Spelman College is one of the only places that actually has an oral history program? Why has it not caught on?
Well, other places have had them, and they kind of come and go according to funding. Spelman's project might be unique in that it's focusing on Black Southern women. University of North Carolina and Duke University did so in talking about the Jim Crow South, maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Will you talk a little bit about the Jim Crow South? Because some of our viewers are younger and may not be as familiar with what you're talking about.
Well, Jim Crow, as it was popularly known, meant racial discrimination by law. And my theory is there's racial discrimination all over. I mean, there's ethnic discrimination, there's all kinds of discrimination throughout the U.S. So it's not just in the South. But in the South, there were laws that said Black children could not go to school with white children. They had to go to their own schools. You couldn't go to the same park if you were Black and white. So there were a variety of things that were mandated by law. So even if, for instance, you thought that was a silly law and you wanted to play with your Black friends, you couldn't really. Not at school, anyway.
When we talk about the Jim Crow era and we talk about the significance of what they say is that, we should always bring up history, because if we don't, history may repeat itself. Tell me about oral history and why Spelman College, for instance, and other universities that you spoke of, what is the benefit of capturing stories?
Well, in the book that Spelman produced as a result of this project.
It's this one, right?
This one, yeah. This is the, I believe this is the fourth volume. Their Memories Are a Treasure. I noticed that most of the women were not just old. Most of the women were activists. They had been professionals. They had done a variety of things. What was different was they spanned at least 2 to 3 generations. You had women in their 60s, women in their 70s, women in their 80s and 90s. And so there were overlapping generations. The key thing, though, was that women in their 60s had grown up with Jim Crow. It wasn't until 1964 that the U.S. Congress agreed to the Civil Rights Act, which basically did away with that. It wasn't until 1954 that the Supreme Court ruled that segregated education was biased.
So that international span and that international view of history and intergenerational view of history is so critical. Well, let's talk a little bit about oral history, though, in and of itself. As a renowned historian, you obviously can appreciate the passing down of history. How does one do that, even if it's in a smaller version with your own grandchildren or your own community?
Well, I think the first thing is children have to be encouraged by the family, by their parents, to listen to what the elders say. A lot of times, and I've seen this, you know, they don't want to be bothered. Oh, she's old. She tells that story over and over and over again. Well, the next time she tells it, tape her so that you can hear it. And then when she tells it again, you can say, listen, I have it on tape. Do you want to hear it? I think we need to make it very important, not just something passing that the old folks talk about the past. A lot of older people don't want to talk about the past because it was so painful.
Right.
And I think then it's the job of the next generation to explain that we need to know so that we don't cause this pain again, or that we don't allow the pain to be caused
Absolutely.
again.
When you talk about the next generation, at Spelman and other universities, it's students that actually take this oral history. Why is it so critical from an academic standpoint that we bring that into play?
A lot of history is written for the elites and by the elites. The ordinary people, whether they're professional or non-professional, their stories are not often maintained. And when they pass away, it's gone. Their history is gone. So oral history is an attempt to get information which we can also verify. I mean, you don't want to take everything at face value. But oral history is a particular methodology for obtaining information verbally that you wouldn't necessarily find in the newspaper or in documents in the library.
I thought it was really interesting in the segment how they talked about many women said, you want to hear about me? I can't believe you want to hear my story. They almost undervalued themselves. From an intergenerational standpoint, before we end our interview, tell me how the relationship can change between immature adult and their grandchild or their community.
Well, I think it's been changing all along, sometimes not for the good. As kids get caught up in their electronic toys and pay no attention. I think if we set aside quiet time and particular days when people can, without television on, maybe with music in the background, or no computer on, where younger people can interact with older people in their families or their communities. It doesn't necessarily have to be a blood relative, because you might not have a grandmother.
I'm from the South. It could be your kinfolks.
Right.
That's what we say.
Right. Or fictive kin, your godparents, or somebody, I mean, in where I grew up in New York and in a lot of black communities, your aunties and uncles were not necessarily blood relatives,
right.
but that was a sign of respect. So you could bring in some older family friends who are close and have them act as surrogate grandparents to talk about the kinds of things that went on in their lives. And I think that would be, and it doesn't necessarily have to be negative things. They could talk about the music that was played in the jazz era, or games that they played. There could be a variety of things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to talk to you about oral histories.